may seem obvious, but okay, hold on, covering my screen. Again, some of these may seem obvious, but I can promise you that when if you're able to think through each bullet point and check off that you're indeed working these bullets, then this is the start of having a great board and great board interaction, meaning not just a good meeting, but something that adds value to your company and helps your company achieve its objectives and for your company to be valued more highly. So again, Tom, I can walk through these, or I don't know if you want to just talk about some of these more openly, but we talk about this later, but one of the things is really for a smaller company, you want to have the right size board. You don't want to have a large board with a lot of people, because again, you can't even get to everybody in a 1-hour meeting or a 2-hour meeting. So the right size is really important. And the mix of skills is really important. So having the right board members who bring the right kinds of backgrounds is really important. Maybe I'll stop there for a minute, Tom, if you want to add anything on that part before we move on.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. First, you sometimes have some control over who's on your board, and you sometimes don't. Boards provide different kinds of roles and different kinds of purposes. A significant part of what they should be doing is to help you in running your company and provide outside experience and exposure and be a source of feedback, a source of a sounding board opportunity for you. But they're also there with many times with their participant hat on, representing either an investment group that's part of your organization or some other vested interest relating to the company. And as you grow as a startup, and with each round of financing that you successfully get, you may have folks that are given a board seat as part of the deal in providing the company with money. Now, technically, they will do two things in that seat. They will represent the interests of that particular investment group, but they're also obliged, and it's really their first obligation, is to look after the interests of the company as a whole. A key distinction everybody should make or understand is that you run your company, they don't. At the end of the day, the board's job is not to get into the weeds and start making decisions that are essential to the core operations, but not necessarily the critical overview type things. They have certain decision-making authority and responsibility, but as it pertains to the day-to-day operations of the business and effectively the running of your board meetings, if you are the CEO, particularly if there is no chairman of the board, you are in charge of those meetings and you're in charge of running your company. And so you need to take on both the proactive obligation and the attitude of these board meetings should serve your purposes. You should have very specific objectives as to what you want to accomplish in them. There are certainly responsibilities you have in terms of dissemination of information, a certain amount of obligatory decisions that require board approval and such. But overall, think of it as part of your overall communications responsibilities in the vested interests of the organization. As to size, I have my own biases. For a startup, if you have more than 5 members on your board, including yourself, you're probably overloaded with board members. Sometimes you have to be, but 5 is probably the sweet amount. If you're an absolute startup, a smaller number than that, say 3, is probably a workable size. But if you get to 7 or more, what you find is you're herding cats, and that's not a really good way to deal with the function of the board.
Great. And I think, Tom, that was great because, again, probably should have started there with really the point that this is your meeting and your board. So both in terms of building the right board to provide value for your progress, as well as managing the meeting to provide value in real time, that's all for you to do. That's really up to you. So we'll get into this in more detail as we talk about the meetings and so on, but part of getting to valuable discussions is making sure you're providing the right board materials and doing pre-prep for the board meeting. So we'll talk about those in more detail. I'm not going to go into that in detail right here, but realize that's part of your communication strategy is what you do before the meeting and information you provide. And pre-prep, which might be pre-meetings, pre-telecons, whatever, so that again, the 1 hour, the 2 hours that you have all of them together are as useful as possible. I do want to say again, just because I've seen this in the past, sometimes for whatever reason, I don't know if it's history or just how people think, some CEOs, again, consider the board almost a little bit of a adversary instead of a help. And so it's really important, again, if you want to get utmost value from this, that you encourage open discussion, put all the information forward that would give a useful discussion. So, information pro a decision, con a decision, the risks to the decision, how you might mitigate the risks. You want a really, really broad and open and comprehensive discussion. And of course you have to manage it so it doesn't go down some useless pathways or just dig down too far into the weeds of less important things. You don't hide or overly manage information. I would say the fastest way to get a board to lose confidence in a CEO or a management team is bad surprises. So it's okay for them to get bad news. That's fine. But if it's a surprise, i.e. the executive team knew about it or knew that it was coming or had information about it, but it's not put forward to the board in real time, that is really a knockout factor usually for CEO. So again, we talked about the fact that, these people are here to help you. There's no other reason for them to be there other than some oversight responsibilities. And so really having a good issue discussion, not just information sharing, but a good discussion of some things that are causing you, the CEO, and your management team to lose sleep at night, or are really puzzling you because they're two equally good ways to go. Those are the kinds of things to put down in front of the board, as well as other, asset allocation, capital allocation, big asset discussions, etc. So Tom, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, just one thought in that regard, which I think helps in figuring out how to deal with different issues at a board meeting. Make a point of distinguishing first for yourself and then as the opportunity arises for the members of the board, what items that you're discussing are discussion points,
right,
and what items are decision points. In the category of decision, you are looking for the board to engage and debate and be making decisions, whether that's with regard to a major contract or some kind of an HR issue, or looking at a potential partnership or other major component like that. And there you need to be very considerate of the way you handle the board. But a lot of the stuff that you would engage in at a board meeting is to provide communication, to try to allow the board to anticipate issues or opportunities that are coming up. And those are discussion points. They don't make decisions. You're looking for their input, or you're providing them with knowledge that will help them in having a context for making decisions or giving advice in the future regarding your company. And with that latter category, you can truncate a discussion. You can simply say, thanks, I think we've got some great information here. I want to take them offline and consider those points. And I appreciate your input and your background. And let's move on to the next issue.
Great. Maybe we should, Jamie, keep moving because.
Okay, I do have one question. At what point should startups begin having board meetings? And is there?
I'll turn that over to you.
It depends. The minute you have a vested outside interest, and that can be in the case of a lot of the companies we're talking about here, where UPenn has an involvement. They have a vested interest. You want to at least have board meetings to keep them formally addressed. Your communications with a board are going to be both formal and informal. The board meetings are the formal part. A lot of communication outside the board meeting should and can take place. But it's certainly, once you have a hardcore investor in the group, you should be having board meetings. The amount of recurrence of the meetings can vary. I'm inclined to argue with startup companies, they should be quarterly. Some people prefer to try to force them as monthly. And when a company's in crises or at a particular point of transition, monthlies may be appropriate. But for the most part, board meetings take up a lot of time. Your time preparing for them, and your board members in their busy schedules trying to allocate time for it. So I'd argue that quarterly is probably a good benchmark. And if you're going to err, I'd err to the side of sooner as opposed to later. Again, with the thought that your purpose here is to effectively communicate to all the vested players that are related to your company.
The only thing I would say, which is more for practice and communication, is I'm a believer in having these meetings even before you have investors, because it's a good discipline to just build up that every quarter you get your key folks together, because you'll probably have a founder. And you may be talking to the founder all the time, but it's still good discipline and practice to sit down, whether it's once a month or once a quarter as appropriate, and just bring everyone together and start to get into the rhythm of what you will have to do when investors are on board. All right. So I think we talked about a lot of this already, but again, just to go into it in a little more detail, as Tom said, I'm also a believer that 3 to 5 members, including the CEO, is the right size for a small company. But then what gets a little more complex is, of course, within that 3 to 4 people, not including the CEO, finding a diversity of skills that are meaningful to the company's current and forward path. I've seen a lot of startups and smaller companies overfill their board with just technology people. You do need subject matter expertise, and some of that may be around the technical field. It might be about, if you're a battery company or an energy company, having somebody with a lot of energy experience. But typically, again, because you can only have 3 to 4 external board members, you may not want more than one of those, at the most 2. It's important to think ahead to where the company's going and think about everything from business expertise, which might be financing, investors, go to market if you're that close to having product that's ready to commercialize, regulatory if you're a med tech or a pharma biotech kind of startup. So really thinking about the diversity and not overfilling too early with people who are just deep in the technology is important. Let's stop there for a minute, and then we'll come back to the soft skills. So Tom, would you like to add to that?
Just a quick thought to pick up on something you said a minute ago. If you think about what the purpose of the meetings are, there's several different kinds of purposes, one of which is governance. And that can be down to just the 2 founders at the start or something like that, where there are obligations to be dealt with there. The other is reporting, and that's formal reporting that can deal with financial issues. In an early stage startup, that's usually just related to how much cash is still in the bank and what's your burn rate, because you don't have revenues yet, all those kinds of things. There are specific decisions that need to be made. That's part of the purpose of a meeting. But the other part is twofold for your own purposes. One is to solicit feedback and get different points of view. That's what Ruby was just talking about. The other, frankly, is to allow you opportunity to construct and methodically kind of gather your own thoughts. And it forces you, in a way, as a discipline, to really constantly be asking yourself, where are we, where we're going, where am I at, what are the issues? And then lastly, you're trying to avoid the surprises. You're trying to anticipate either problems or opportunities that are coming up.
And just to add to that, once you have the right business skills, technical skills, the content knowledge, the knowledge expertise, the soft skills are really important. I would tell you that in public boards, people almost hire board members, bring in board members almost 2/3 based on soft skills and only 1/3 based on subject matter expertise. And that's because if you don't have the right soft skills, you're not going to get value out of that board. It can become a very dysfunctional entity. So I'm saying obvious things, but making sure that the potential board members through at least a couple of meetings well enough to get a sense of their style. Are they constructive? Are they able to discuss with others? Of course, you want respected experience and expertise. That goes without saying. But the soft skills and their ability to work within a group of peers to effect, influence, change, deal with what can be difficult issues or difficult decisions. That's really key. Tom.
Yeah, just one other thought that I think is particularly germane with the bulk of the people we're chatting with here. We're dealing with situations that have historically been involved with R&D, with the development of technologies, with experimentation and identifying solutions to potential problems. When PCI gets involved, it's at the point where the objective is to migrate that activity into the activity of making money. And those are completely different categories of management skill. So part of what happens and part of what the board ideally should help the company do is help make that transition from thinking specifically and particularly as it pertains to continued development and research of the core technology that's being exploited versus the increasingly soft skill issues that have to do with entering the market, dealing with working with other commercial enterprises to make things happen, and ultimately to give the business the best opportunity to make money out of the hard work and skill and creativity that went into the development of the products and services in the first place.
Are there any questions? Again, we want to really encourage questions. There may be some of you in the Zoom who are having board meetings now and are seeing what's working and what's not working. So again, please make this discussion useful to yourselves by asking us questions or taking us where you want to go. Jamie, shall we move on?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Tom, did you want to take this on as startup, and I can add to whatever you want to?
Sure, why not?
I know.
I'm reading this in real time.
Yeah, sorry, but it's basic stuff, so you'll get it.
Yeah. Essentially, the before the meeting is both planning and communications, right? So the agenda is a critical item. What you're going to be doing is putting together the objectives you have for the meeting and any obligatory issues that need to be addressed in the meeting. You're communicating through the agenda what you're intending to have dealt with at the session. And you can choose what you are or are not queuing up for the board to deal with at any particular meeting. You essentially are in control of the agenda, although you may have board members who specifically request that certain things be added. And then essentially, it makes sense to have communication with your board or members of your board ahead of time so that they can give you a heads up of things that they want to make sure are covered, or you can give them an idea of where the meeting's going. And if there are specific challenges or problems that need to be addressed with, it's not a bad idea to get some sounding board feedback from different board members to try to make sure that those issues are effectively and productively dealt with at the meetings themselves. And at the end of the day, though, what you should have through the before the meeting activity is the preparation of essentially what I would call a board package that would include the agenda, probably a cover letter from you kind of conveying or memo or email conveying the intent that you have for the meeting in terms of its goals and objectives. And that should be so, and any specific documentation that would be helpful in any of the subjects you want to get into in more of a deep dive discussion at the meetings themselves. So some kind of a package that's probably a few pages long, not 20 pages, maybe 5, maybe 10 at the most, depending on the subject matter. But it's something that you should get to the board well in advance of the meetings, so they have enough time to actually go through the stuff before they come to the meeting. And you should be in a position to have expected them to have looked at it before they walk in the door as well. So the timing, give yourself enough time to queue up, and then give your board members enough time to look at whatever materials you're sending, so that they come to the meeting prepared for what's going to happen. Ruby, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah, sorry. A question from Thomas that deals with the mix of the board. Can you talk about the mechanics and timing of selecting a chair and the roles and responsibilities of a chair?
Yeah, usually for startups, you don't have a chair of the board that is different from the CEO. That can differ, particularly if a company gets into trouble, and there is a concern that there needs to be more seasoned, experienced guidance for the board during a difficult point in time. That'll happen. But most of the startups that I've been involved with, the CEO is effectively the chair. Chair positions tend to come into effect as the companies grow, and when the responsibilities of a CEO versus a COO have developed and gotten complex enough that sometimes having a separate person as the chair makes sense then. But I would view it for startups as the exception as opposed to the rule.
So it's a little hard to totally delineate roles and responsibilities because, of course, you're the CEO and the chair. But I would say in the chair hat, with the chair hat on, it is about forming an agenda, and it's good to, again, make sure that your key board members feel that your agenda is complete and addresses all the issues that they think are on the board's mind. So that's like what a chair usually does, has a couple of conversations, make sure the agenda is okay with the typical, from the typical board members. Also the management of the meeting, usually if there's a separate CEO and chair, the chair will be making sure the meeting is moving and that all the board members are involved and are getting addressed what they need to get addressed. Again, the responsibility of the board as a whole, as Tom has already said, is oversight, guidance, governance. But I'm just talking about the difference between a chair and a CEO around the board meeting. The chair would also be responsible for making sure that that the follow-up items aren't being lost, that they're being recorded. Tom, help me out here. What else, when you think of just what a chair might do around the board meeting as opposed to other things?
No, I think you've pretty much covered it.
Okay. Sorry, there's one more question. Let me just get to that. Please discuss the term length for non-assigned board members, e.g. dedicated investor seat, as well as the appropriate compensation for startup board members. Tom, I'm going to turn that over to you as well.
For startups, my recommendation is that the compensation is 0 to start. That is a poor allocation of your limited cash. And I think if you have board members that don't appreciate that or understand that, that is really their problem and not the company's. You have an obligation to try to move the company from its initiation to the point where it can stand on its own. And allocation of cash for anything you don't have to allocate it to is a mistake in that regard. As it relates to board members who are at the board meeting because they've been given a seat as a result of a financing. What usually happens is that that is a seat that remains in place, though it can be, usually the terms of the financing will include what rights the investment group has with regard to a board seat, and that investment group can in fact replace that member that is representing them. But what you'll find, I think, in the early days, early 2 or 3 years, frankly, is that your board will get reconfigured with each major financing that occurs, because the new money, and the new money always tends to drive what happens. The new money will put out specifications as to its requirements for what board representation they have, and they will usually also specify what they want the size of the board to be, and they will even strongly recommend how they would like that configured. They won't say specific people, but they might say management has 1 or 2 seats. Founders or existing seed share members have another seat. Investor of the A round has 1 seat. Investor of the B round has 1 seat, something like that. And so you can expect that there will be a natural opportunity to change the configuration of the board every time there is a major influx of money coming into the company.
Tom, Eric also brought up another point. Other than meeting with somebody in advance, how can you help guide the meeting to stay on track and with deal with certain people that may tend to hijack the meeting?
That can be a real challenge. I think going back to what I said a little earlier is important. Distinguish between items that are discussion points versus decision points. In any kind of a situation that is a discussion point, you can and should, in managing the time of the meeting, be able to politely end the conversation. You can suggest that it's a conversation that can be taken up offline after the meeting, but that's one way. If you know ahead of time that there is a consistent cause of those kinds of disruptions, you might look for some guidance or assistance from other members of the board who are more productive in their relationship with you, and it can be very helpful to have another board member intercede and suggest that we move on to another topic, and then you jump on board and say, yes, let's go. That sometimes works. If you have a definitive disruptor, almost nothing works, because they're rant. They do it. It's unproductive. You should try to anticipate that as much as you can, and try to have the other board members sensitive to the fact that there's a certain number of items that have to be gotten through at this meeting, and we've given this sufficient time and we need to move on. It's not a perfect science.
Right. Eric, I don't know if that fully answered your question, but if you want to, any like real specifics. So for example, with one of the PCI companies that I worked with around their board meetings, it also depends on who the people are. For example, in their case, they felt that the technical people, which I think were the founders or people associated with the founders, were hijacking the meeting, because they would just start to, just drill into the slides and want to know everything. So in that case, a preview meeting did help. He was able to meet with them offline and spend a couple of hours if needed to take them through the level of detail they wanted. It apparently really calmed down the board meetings. But again, depends on where the person is coming from, if there is some sort of logic behind what they're trying to get at, versus, as Tom said, just people who are real disruptors.
No, actually, it's just
for no particular reason.
no. It's sometimes you just find cantankerous people who like to hear themselves talk.
Yeah, that's, as Tom said, it's hard. It might be time to talk about term limits for your particular board members then. It's hard. I mean, that can happen on any board, which is why I mentioned before that, really thinking about the soft skills, other than with investors where you may not have a choice, or any place you have a choice at all, thinking through that is important.
One thing you could try, I won't claim that it necessarily will work, but if you are deliberate right up front in the meeting, to basically, you've got the agenda in front of everybody, and you simply lay out, here's what we need to get through at this meeting, here's what I'm hoping to get through, and distinguish, and here are the key things that we must get through. And then we have some other categories of things that we're hoping to be able to address as a board. But we only have X amount of time because, well, whatever the reason, certain board members, have other obligations that they got to go to. So this is the agenda, what we need to get through in a meeting that we're aiming for to last no more than an hour, hour and a half, 2 on the outside. And so you've set it up to say, when the thing is running out of control, you can come back and say, look, as I said at the beginning, we have all this stuff to get through. We really need to move on. We can try to address some of these things offline if we need to.
By the way, I mean, a real basic thing that may seem silly, but it helped me on one of my public boards with my committee is when you do the agenda, put time allocations next to the agenda items. I can't promise that it'll stop people running over or being difficult, but you do find that a lot of people don't manage time in their heads. So, when they're talking away or drilling into one point, they've completely lost track of the fact that you have many items to get through and you only have so much time for each item. So very basic, but it does sometimes help when people can just keep checking what time it says on the agenda. This item is from, I also don't put 10 minutes. I put 11 to 11:10, 11:10 to 11:25, just trying to make it really obvious that, we need to hold to some sort of a schedule. Does it, again, may not work with someone who's determined to be heard at length.
Speaking of, I will move on to the next slide.
Okay. All right. I guess, again, I was trying to just do some really, the kind of the tedious, how do you just manage a meeting? But of course, there are bigger issues around making sure you're getting value out of the meeting. But, most board meetings, and again, I don't know about startup meetings, but you do need to note the attendance because that should be in your notes. Also helps for people who are not attending the meeting regularly to see attendance is being noted. As Tom said many times, again, reviewing, even if you send out a cover note or something, reviewing the agenda at the beginning is not just about going through agenda items, it's about setting expectations for the meeting. So as he said, agenda item 3, we need a decision. You may even want to put that in the agenda, below item 3, you would have decision needed, and what the decision will be. Also emphasize what is purely informational. And I forgot to mention one thing, use an appendix, and use an appendix wisely, meaning, even if you're having just an informational session or even for decisions, there's information that, if you really only have 10 to 15 pages, you can go through in an hour with the board. You may have backup materials and you're sending your package out ahead of time, the deck out ahead of time. So have all the extra material that you think they need to know or be reminded of in the appendix. Each agenda item can have an appendix. But do not try to go through the appendix material during the meeting, other than maybe if you quickly have to refer to a page or so. As Tom said, your expectation needs to be, and you need to make clear to them that they're to read the materials before they come in. And you need to, sort of mentally note if people are not doing that, so that you can have a discussion outside the meeting. Usually notes are published, at least in the meetings I'm aware of, and it's a good practice because you want to make sure everybody's on the same page afterwards. Doesn't mean you'd put any confidential discussion in there. You might just say, for this agenda item, there was a discussion around these points. You don't have to go into the discussion, but you kind of at least note the follow-up actions and the decisions and so on, so that everyone's on the same page and people aren't revisiting decisions that were already made or worried that their pet item is not going to be followed up on. Using a parking lot, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it's, you know, when you were in-person meetings, it was easier because you could note it on a board or a flip chart or something, but finding a way even on Zoom, maybe in the chat, to note when you need to cut off discussion that, you know, you're aware the discussion isn't finished and these points still need to be followed up on. I mean, it's human psychology. When you see something written down and noted, then you can let go of the anxiety that it's going to fall through the cracks. And so, and Tom, maybe you could talk a bit about just how to manage the meeting itself, you know, the dynamics. I mean, we've already talked about the disruptors and so on, but I don't know if there's any more that we can help with there.
Just a couple of thoughts. I mean, the old saw is, you know, Robert's Rules of Order seems like, you know, a cliche at this stage in the world, but it does help. I mean, you are there. It is for a formal meeting, and it does provide guidelines that you can rely on to give some structure to what you're doing. Another point as it relates to note takers, someone other than yourself taking notes, just to be clear. And the other thing about it, and this goes to the issue of minutes. Minutes are approval of the previous minutes. It's going to be one of the first things you want to do.
Yes.
And to get that out of the way, minutes are a very important part of the process. And it is as important to note what you put in them. It's important to note as much about what you don't put in them as it is what you do. To a certain extent, the minute should convey what occurred without going into detail, almost always without going into detail. If a decision has been made, you designate that. If a topic has been addressed, you designate that. If a battle took place in the board meeting, you may or may not even address it, or if you do, it was actively discussed. You know, you understate the hell out of it. So that's an important dynamic there. Otherwise, this is pretty much the right list. At the end, it's, you know, the old tell them what you're going to say, then tell them what you said, then say it, and then tell them what you said, as in a speech. You have something similar here with a board meeting. Right up front, tell them what you expect to get through, then go through the process, and at the end, sum up. And then what we'll get to in a minute with the follow-ups is any kind of follow-up items that have been identified. At the end of the meeting, make sure you re-articulate these are the follow-up items. And then after the fact, make sure that whomever is supposed to follow up does in fact do that.
Good. Jamie, I think we can move to after the meeting. Sorry, there's a question. Hold on one second. Is it reasonable to request board members to undertake small background research projects, i.e. market, regulatory, fact check on competition, or are these tasks considered strictly the duties of the organizational staff? Tom, do you want to start off?
Yeah, I would say that if a board member has the particular expertise, experience, connections to be able to contribute and is willing to do so, it's not wrong to ask an assignment to be made. It's not their job. And as such, if they don't want to, then you don't want them to. Technically, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning. Running the company is your business, not the board's. The board is not there to make operating decisions. The kinds of decisions they ultimately make are along the lines of saying, well, I no longer have faith in management, so I'll make the decision to change management. But management has the responsibility for running the company.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, usually it is not usual, I guess, that something would be taken on as an assignment. Where board members are often willing to help is with, you know, if you want them to mentor somebody in the company, they might be willing to put a few hours into that. If you want them to give you the benefit of their experience or expertise. So you said, I think, Robert, that you had asked about market. You know, if someone's been deeply in a market, they may be willing to sit down with someone in the company and kind of review their knowledge or review, some data that they might have. But usually it's not it's unusual to ask them to, or assume that they would go do additional forward work that is not based on things they already know. So
Thank you.
fact check, so competition, yeah, they could review what they know, or the market, or regulatory. I mean, we have mentors who do a lot of regulatory help to some of the pharma and biotech startups at PCI. But again, and by the way, what you should use your board for is to make introductions. So if, from their contact list, if they can introduce you to people who might be willing to take on assignments. But I would have to say at that point, you'd probably have to compensate these other people, they would be small consulting projects.
Thank you.
One add on to that. At some point, you may find that you are adding board members who are third-party board members. They are deliberately brought into the mix because they don't have a vested interest, but they have knowledge or expertise or relationships to an industry sector or a functional category that is critical to the company. Those board members, when you get to that point, are more likely to perhaps have some compensation, not always though, but also those board members may be more willing to take on those kinds of assignments because it's kind of, part of the dynamic of what they're contributing.
Right.
Thank you.
I think we've covered everything on this page. Maybe the only one we haven't covered is, as you're recapping and summarizing the meeting, including the follow-up items, you can morph that into a discussion about what should be on the next month's agenda or the next quarter's agenda. So it's good to sort of survey the board, because they may bring up something that wasn't something you were thinking of, or that and the nice thing is, if they bring up something, it's on their minds. So it's a way of, again, surveying the group to find out what their hot buttons are. But other than that, as Tom said, it is important. I really liked what Tom said about creating a little bit of a formality to the board meeting. Doesn't mean you have to be in your suit and tie or anything, but, create it. I mean, that's why I said it's good to practice even before you have investors. This is a different animal from your other meetings. So the more you can make it serious, the more you can make it a little tiny bit formal by handling agendas and minutes and meeting management professionally, the more that helps to corral dysfunctional members, the more that helps to make the meetings as value-filled as possible. I mean, it really is a time when everybody comes up for air, whether it's executive management or the board members from what they're usually doing. And they really kind of focus in on the company for that entire hour or 2 hours, but also they're trying to think, you're trying to think big thoughts, strategic stuff, as well as operating stuff. So to have that clarity of mind and clarity of purpose, it's important to run the meeting well. And you should not accept, because I remember when I met with the CEO, or it might have been an interim CEO for the company that I mentioned before. I mean, they had had months of meetings that were just frustrating. Everyone was frustrated, by the way. The board members were frustrated, management was frustrated, the mentors were, PCI team was much frustrated. And I guess, as I said, part of it is doing all these things we've talked about, but part of it is also just establishing that this is your meeting, as Tom said right at the beginning. I mean, the board members are invited to attend and to provide value, but it is your meeting. And therefore, giving it the importance that it deserves by managing professionally is going to be helpful to you to get what you want out of it. Tom, let me hand it over.
Another thing you can do that can help in a couple of ways in that regard is, and this will vary depending on the exact stage that your company is at, but there should, in the reporting function, be a way to provide very concise but key information that really falls into two categories. One is that identifies, think of it as kind of a
excuse me, sorry.
A summation I've lost the word I'm trying to. You should have in your reporting two primary things: coverage of key performance indicators, whatever they may be. Those could have at the development stage, it could be key elements in the development exercise and how far they've gotten or how much is along. But ideally, you have benchmarks of some sort that can, as metrics, define the progress that's being made. And the other is finance. And finance at the beginning may simply mean we've got X dollars left in the bank account and our burn rate is Y. And so that translates into having enough money to last this long. Later on, it's going to be honest to goodness financials. It's going to be a P&L. It's going to be a balance sheet. It should always, with a startup, include a cash flow statement, regardless, because the most important thing for your survival as a startup is cash flow, pure and simple. It's getting it to come in from wherever, whether it's grants or investors or however, before you run out, and it's being able to use it properly and have it extend as far as you need to get to go to the next step where you can get some more money in. So having that as a consistent part of the package where your board members can expect to look and see, okay, here are the real criteria of progress, operationally, financially, whatever. At some point, it may include something like sales. You know, it's going to be different elements, and you could decide what the proper metrics are. But that frames the discussion up front. It's another piece of formality that you're introducing. It's a summation that really helps everybody see where you're starting from in terms of the meeting.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time. I don't know if there are any remaining questions for any of you. Happy to take them.
Thank you, Tom and Ruby, so much. I am going to stop the recording and we can stay on for a few more minutes just in case any of you have specific questions. Happy to get those answered.